My son Leon is 3. It's a great age. Aside from suddenly finding poo and farts as funny as I do, he's also started grappling with big concepts. Stuff like the extinction of the dinosaurs, human anatomy and evolution. Actually, after I spoke with him about evolution, he turned to my partner and he said, "Mom, did you used to be a monkey?" So he's grappling with some stuff, but clearly timescales are not something he's wrapped his head around yet. He's also been very interested in the concept of death, which is not surprising. Aside from the extinction of the dinosaurs, which tends to bring up things like death, the topic has been kind of in high rotation in our house since my father passed away. He got sick last November, and his health declined really rapidly. And then, very, very suddenly, he was dead. And it was a total shock, and it still kind of is. And I got to see him shortly before he died, but I wasn't able to fly back for the memorial. So my partner, Kepi, and my son, Leon, and our 6-month-old daughter, Elodie, flew to the States on a plane for a belated memorial this past June. But luckily, my father's body was preserved in this airless chamber made of glass, just waiting for my return, just like Mao and Lenin's had been. It was super cool. He was a really, really important guy. Well, to me. No, he was just cremated, but the ashes were compacted into this tiny action figure in his perfect likeness, only 7 centimeters high, and it was crazy. It was as hard as diamond and as heavy as uranium. I swear, no, that's not true. No, they were just regular old ashes. They were shockingly regular, actually. My father had been living in a small town called Great Barrington in western Massachusetts. It's a cute little town with a booming summer tourist industry that my father, who was a freelance advertiser, never quite tapped into. Growing up, things never quite worked out financially for my family, and yet somehow we always thought of ourselves as solidly middle class. And in retrospect, I feel like my parents must have put a lot of work into that to pull that off. Western Massachusetts is a leafy, green place in the summer full of hiking trails and overgrown baseball diamonds and like freezing cold streams and rivers. And for my father's memorial, we picked out a spot by a lake, a kind of secluded lake, and we decided we would dig a hole with permission, and put his ashes in it and then plant a tree on top of the ashes and have a picnic. My younger brother, who's the guy with the beard, and myself and my older sister, who's the one on the right, looking as shocked as I am. We were tasked with picking out a tree for the occasion, and the day of the memorial was the following day, and so we just drove around together to a couple of local nurseries. And I love my siblings. I love spending time with them, but like this was a really awkward afternoon. Like kind of no one really knew how to talk about what we were setting out to do. And walking around our first nursery between rows of scraggly trees as we baked in the summer heat, the scope of our task began to dawn on us because we weren't there just to pick out a tree. We were there to pick out a tree that was my dad, that was our father, that somehow represented him. Which is a little bit confusing because, I don't know, I had a picture of him earlier, but my father was not a tree. So we began looking through trees and having these weird discussions like, hey, was Dad an oak? And we're all like, oh, no, definitely not an oak. Like, that wasn't him. Hey, was Dad an apple tree? Like, what a weird thing to say. I never saw my dad eat an apple. I don't know if it's because he had dentures his whole life, but yeah, never saw him bite into one. Or crispy bread. I don't know, who knew? But they don't have crispy bread trees, so we were saved that nightmare. Was he a crabapple tree with its little small sour fruit? That somehow seemed ironic and funny, And I remember actually, like, this was attached to a memory. I remember as kids, we would have these big crabapple fights with the neighbors. And they were really fun until someone was successful because crab apples are basically rocks with stems. So someone would get hit and then it was just like a nightmare of like political parenting for everyone involved. So we decided not. Eastern redbud. None of us knew what an eastern redbud was. Dogwood. They've got really beautiful flowers. I remember we had one outside a driveway one time. And I remember my dad liking them, but then I remember slipping in like the muck that the flowers made when they fell off and rotted. Like this slick, weird smear. It was disgusting. So we decided not to do that one. What about a birch? A birch was good. I remember peeling off the papery bark as a kid and drawing schematics of my badly designed traps and snares when I was out in the woods. They were like the worst survival advice a child could find. Like if anyone else had found them and was trying to live, it wouldn't have gone well. So I had this like personal connection, and so did my siblings. And then our dad was like a really pasty white guy. And every summer when we were on vacation, he would always inevitably get terribly sunburned the first day of vacation in an extremely preventable, like we would have the sunscreen sitting there. And then his skin would peel. So, like, that's what happens with the tree. The kind of white bark starts to peel away. And we were like, yeah, that's kind of cool. Like, yeah. Dad, you know? So we decided on this birch, but then we realized that couldn't possibly represent our father because it was way too expensive. Who knew? Like, they grow everywhere, but yeah. So on second thought, like, it was in bad taste. So we did some looking at the price tags this time, and we went back to the crabapple tree. And it was very reasonable at $249. After we read that, we were like, oh, God, it kind of does look like him. It really does look like him. The resemblance is actually uncanny now that I'm thinking about it. Yeah, it looks just like him. We kind of do double takes, like as if he was standing there. So we had this major realization, you know? But then I had another one. When I was looking around this last nursery, I figured out that there were other plants, not just trees. And I realized that this was a perfect opportunity to buy a second decoy tree as a ringer for the ceremony. So I could pick out this tiny little tree and then present it to my mom and say, do you want to carry Dad's tree? So that's what I did. I picked out this tiny little tree. And we gathered in the car park, and we prepared to walk down to the spot, and I very ceremoniously took this tree out of a box, and I walked it over to my mom, and I was like, hey, Mom, do you want to carry Dad's tree down to the lake? And she was totally fooled for like 2 seconds. But for those 2 seconds, she definitely thought that me and my two siblings had picked out this runty, shriveled little 6-inch potted plant to put down by the lake. She had a good sense of humor about it, luckily. So from the parking lot, we walked down to the lake, and it was this really spectacular summer day, just the kind of day that would have burnt my dad. So we went to our pre-dug hole, and my sister shook out our dad's ashes into it. And then my younger brother and I placed the crabapple tree on top of it, and then we just shoveled on some dirt and watered the tree with buckets. And then we took water from the lake. And then we just sat there for a while. And the whole thing was really surreal and difficult and lovely and just like achingly sad. And then that afternoon, we go back home, and Leon kind of goes off by himself, and I find him thoughtfully poking a dead fly. So I was interested. And I walked over to him, and I looked down at him, and he turns to me, and he was like, Dad, when we die, we don't come back? And I told him, no, we don't come back. And the fly was dry and brittle, and so when he poked it again, its wings just fell off. And then he asked, Dad, when we die, do we break apart? And I said, yeah, we do. Our bodies break down and we go back to the earth. Yeah. And then a tree grows out of us? And I thought about it for a few seconds. And we just looked at the bits of dead fly. And I thought about my dad. And then I just decided not to overcomplicate it, you know? And so I was like, yeah, close enough. Yeah, That's a really nice way to think about it, Leon. Yeah. And it felt good having this quiet moment of connection with him. And I thought we had both done well, that we'd reached this mutual understanding. And I felt like this great, wise parent. But then we went outside to play in the backyard. And I was like, oh, fuck. Oh, shit. And I could actually see on my son's face this new unintended connection being made between trees and the recently deceased. And I stood there with him for a little while, just looking up at the trees behind the house, trying to see them the way that he did. And I thought about correcting him, but then I thought, nah, close enough. Thank you.